Hello and welcome to another edition of Grant's World. In this issue, we will hear from our Executive Director, Ann Marshall, who will bring you up to date on the Grant Presidential Library. You will also hear about our upcoming plans for the next membership meeting of the Ulysses S. Grant Association in St. Louis, Missouri. And from our past Executive Director, John Marszalek, and his wife, Jeanne, who just made a gracious donation of $25,000 to the Grant Association. We will talk with Ryan Sims about the recent donation of the John Rawlins collection. And I interviewed John Reeves about his latest book, Soldier of Destiny. And I just wanted to add, if you ever have a topic you'd like to hear discussed or anything else, please drop me a line at the email listed below, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it. All right, as they say, let the show begin.
Well, hello and welcome to the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library. We've been busy here as we usually are. A couple things have been taking up a good bit of our time lately. First of all, we are deep in the planning process for our brand new freestanding library. We have been working with architects and exhibit designers who are coming up with all kinds of fantastic ideas for us, and we're throwing ideas and content back at them. And so we're really quite busy doing all of that. And while we don't have any proof of this to show you quite yet, that should be coming very soon, hopefully by the end of the spring. So maybe by the time the summer video newsletter rolls around, we'll be able to share some more information and maybe even some pictures with you. The other exciting thing that we have going on here is that we have now received the John Rawlins collection that we were able to acquire thanks to the generosity of a donor named Turner Wingo, who is a huge supporter of Mississippi State University and also the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library. We were able to get these papers last summer, and we are in the process of processing them and making good use of them right away, actually. I was able to incorporate these papers into a class that I offered to our PhD graduate students here at Mississippi State in the history program last fall, and they've been working on examining artifacts and describing them and creating labels for them, all in the hopes of using them for a exhibit that we are planning to launch in the year 2024, probably in the fall. So we're so excited about this new collection that we have, and we'll be linking to a news story that came out in the local Starkville newspaper about the collection and its story in this newsletter as well. And the last thing that I wanted to highlight and that I wanted to invite you all to is a program that we're going to be hosting and sponsoring alongside the Frank and Virginia Williams collection of Lincolniana. This program is on February 6th, and we'll be talking with historian Yael Sternhell, who teaches history at Tel Aviv University. And she has a new book out called War on Record, The Archive and the Aftermath of the Civil War. And this book examines, actually all these books behind me, examines the history of what is known as the official records, or the OR for short. And so Dr. Sternhell looks at the creation of this voluminous archive of Civil War history and documents upon which many, many historians have based their own research, and she examines how these archives were put together in a not so straightforward fashion, and that there were lots of fights about what to include and what to exclude. And it's going to be a fascinating conversation about a very fascinating and important book. And so we hope you'll join us for this program that's going to be on February 6th. A live webinar, so you'll have to pre-register, and we'll also include the link for that registration in this newsletter as well. But it'll be February 6th at 1 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Central. So we hope you'll join us and you'll have a chance to send in questions and comments as we're talking to Dr. Sternhell. Well, that's all we have for right now, and we'll talk to you the next time.
So the John Rawlins papers that we've recently acquired contain a variety of materials related to his life, mostly his life around the Civil War time up through his last year, which would have been the first year of the Grant presidency and his time as Secretary of War. There are letters from the Civil War era, the early years of the Civil War era, from Rawlins to his wife. These tend to be a bit more about family-related related things. A lot of the correspondence that we have from his time as Secretary of War is incoming correspondence, invitations to different events, meetings, dinners, things like that. There's also a family scrapbook that contains a number of newspaper clippings related to his life and in particular to his death. He died fairly young, and he died less than a year into Grant's first year of his presidency. And then there are some artifacts in the collection, which includes all of his shoulder straps from the rank of captain up to the rank of major general. So we have all of those in the collection, as well as some patches that went with his hat, and then just other sundry items that came with the collection. And then another portion of the collection is family correspondence in the years after his death, going through the late 19th century of his children and grandchildren, his second wife, and all of them writing to one another through the end of the 19th century. This collection, though, complements what we already have in our existing collections here at the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library, in particular in the personal papers of President Ulysses S. Grant and First Lady Julia Grant. We have their copies of speeches that General Rawlins made in 1868 in various cities on President Grant's behalf during the campaign for the presidency. As well as some Rawlins letters in that collection. We have Rawlins letters in the Fred Grant collection. And then within our papers of Ulysses S. Grant collection, we have duplicates, reproductions of thousands of Rawlins letters throughout the Civil War, the interim period of the beginning of Reconstruction, and then, of course, his time as Secretary of War. The collection is I think going to be really interesting to scholars who are interested in the life of Rawlins, because it not only shows you, some of his experiences as Secretary of War, but it really gives you a look into his personal life with his correspondence with his wife, and then with his second wife and their family, after his death, and the things that they're writing about and their lived experiences. One of the more curious items in the collection is a handwritten copy of a letter that Rawlins wrote to General Ulysses S. Grant in Vicksburg in 1863. This is a letter that Rawlins writes to Grant about his concerns about the perceptions of his drinking. He talks about how Grant was basically hanging around a bad element in camp. Someone had sent, I believe, a case of champagne, and some of the officers got into their cups, so to speak. And Grant was, I think, with them, according to this letter that Rawlins wrote. This is a letter that we have published in the papers of Ulysses S. Grant, so it is a known letter. The only copies of it had been published, I believe, in newspapers or in other accounts. This letter is not written in Rawlins's handwriting. It is written on 19th century soldiers' paper. And then on the back of it is a notation that says that this letter was not given to General Grant. Instead, General Rawlins spoke to General Grant about the contents of the letter, and they came to an agreement. There is an original letter written at Chattanooga that has very similar language in it. And in this one, Rawlins is appealing to Grant on a grand scale, comparing him to George Washington at Valley Forge and saying that the nation, the history of the nation rests on his shoulders, and that when Mrs. Grant is not in camp, he tends to, again, find himself with a bad element and drinks with them. This letter was given to Grant, and we do know that this letter was given to Grant. The original of this letter in Rawlins' handwriting does exist in an archives and has been published in the papers of Ulysses S. Grant. And I think sometimes these two letters get conflated, but the Vicksburg letter, again, the one that we have, is not in Rawlins' handwriting, but it is the type of copy that an aide de camp would have possibly copied for General Rawlins. So it's a bit confusing. It certainly belonged to the Rawlins family because it was with the Rawlins family in this collection. But having the original never been given to Grant, and this being a copy of an original that doesn't exist, it's a perplexing document, but it's one that I'm sure historians will be happy to come look at and maybe dig a little deeper on. Important that we have this collection because materials from John Rawlins and the Rawlins family are quite rare. It's a kind of legend in the world of Civil War archives that there are no John Rawlins papers. And in some ways that's true. In other ways, it's not true. It's just that there has never really been one single John Rawlins collection. And so here at Mississippi State University at the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library, we have this John Rawlins collection that we acquired that is one of the larger collections of Rawlins related materials in a public archives and institution. And that's what makes it an important collection because there's so little out there.
Jim, I just want to give the members a little overview of the 2024 meeting that's going to be held in St. Louis from May 2nd to May 5th. We think we have a nice itinerary planned, 2 full days of activities. First of all, the lodging we selected was a newly refurbished Holiday Inn in St. Louis County, which is only about 10 minutes from Whitehaven. So it's a good central location and a good, safe neighborhood. The hotel has given the members a discounted rate of $129 per night plus tax. So we think that is going to be a cost savings measure for the members who attend. So the itinerary for the meeting is as such. On Thursday to May 2nd in the evening, we'll have the customary registration at the hotel, and then a meet and greet with cocktails and hors d'oeuvres, which the members can get reacquainted if we haven't seen each other in a year. And then the agenda will be explained in full to the members. And then the following morning, Friday, we will go to Grant's Farm. Grant's Farm is a 281-acre wildlife preserve, which is directly across the street from the U.S. Grant National Historic Site, or Whitehaven, if you prefer. It's, as I said, a wild game preserve. The park will be closed to the general public, so we'll have the whole park to ourselves, which is a bonus. And what that day will consist of is the trams will take us on a tour of the wildlife preserve, and we'll see animals from bison to longhorn steers, etc. But the bonus is we will stop and get off the tram and tour Hardscrabble, which everybody knows is the log cabin that Grant built in the 1850s. Now, Hardscrabble is normally closed to the public. It's only opened on special occasions, and we are one of those special occasions. So the National Park Service from across the street will have a ranger there, and we'll have some other docents to conduct the tour of the cabin and answer any questions that the members might have about the cabin that Grant built. And from there, we'll get back on the tram and go to the Barnhof area of Grant's Farm. And what that is a courtyard where lunch will be served. And adjacent to the courtyard is the historic carriage house owned by the Bush family, the owners of Grant's Farm. There are some historic carriages and sleighs in that carriage house, some of which are representative of the vehicles that we used during Grant's time. And from there, we will go across the street to Whitehaven, where we'll have the afternoon session, which consists of 3 stations that are going to be set up. Station 1 will be a tour of the historic home led by a ranger. The second station will be a tour of the museum, which is in the historic barn that Grant had built in the 1860s and 70s. And then the third station will be a living history performance by a local college professor by the name of Greg Carr. He puts on frequent living history performances there at Whitehaven, and he's going to portray William Jones, the African-American who Grant owned at one time and later freed. So we think the owners will get a kick out of that. And then we'll return to the hotel for a rest break, and that evening we'll go to our first banquet and lecture, which is at a local restaurant called Bartolino's, where the keynote speaker will be Nick Sacco, who is the acting historian and curator for Whitehaven, and he will be talking about Grant and St. Louis, which is appropriate. That is the theme of the meeting. Then the next day, buses will take us to historic Jefferson Barracks, where Grant was stationed in the 1840s and is where he was stationed when he met Julia. 2 activities will take place there. The groups will split into 2. We'll have a bus tour of the historic grounds. They have 3 buildings that date to the 1850s. They will be incorporated into the tour. The other half of the group will tour the Missouri Civil War Museum, which is on site there, and we think they'll enjoy that. And then after 1 hour, the 2 groups will swap and then go through the other attraction. And from there, the bus takes us to downtown St. Louis to the historic Robert Campbell Mansion. It's one of the few antebellum mansions that still exist in St. Louis. There is a definite Grant connection to the Campbell house. Grant and Robert Campbell were friends. Grant visited his house in St. Louis at least 3 times during his presidency. He also hosted Campbell and his family at the White House. We will tour the house and we'll have lunch on the grounds. And the lunch will be a 19th century historic cuisine type of buffet. A local cuisine historian is going to prepare Grant food that was popular during Grant's time, including his favorite dessert, a gingerbread cake. When we're done at the Campbell House, we'll go to the St. Louis Arch, where we will have 2 lectures, one by Pam Sanfilippo, who is the chief of education there and used to be the historian at Whitehaven. She will talk about the St. Louis courthouse and some of the exhibits. And then we'll have a second lecture by Lynn Jackson, who is a direct descendant of Dred Scott. And she will be talking to us about slavery and reparations. And then from there, we'll go back to the hotel for a break. And then we will not be leaving the Holiday Inn. We will stay there for the balance of the meeting. And that evening, we'll have a lecture by Harold Holzer. We'll be talking about Grant, Lincoln, and immigration policies. And then we'll have our meal. And that evening, we'll conclude. Next morning at Holiday Inn, we have our pastries and coffee. Then we'll have the board of directors meeting and then the general members meeting. And then the meeting will adjourn about 10 a.m. on Sunday morning. So that is the agenda, and I think and hope that the members will enjoy it.
This is just an informal thing. And first, I want to personally thank you for your donation that you made to the Ulysses S. Grant Association. That is so kind of you. And I just wanted to ask the question, John, you being the past executive director, what made you make that decision, the two of you?
Well, you know what it was, Jim. It was we talked about it for a good amount of time, and Jeanne has been going up to the place and doing some work, et cetera, et cetera. And the result is that she's met some people. She's talked to Ann, and Ann was saying that one of the big things we really needed was money. We always do. We always needed money when I was there too. So that was the answer. We just decided that since we were able to do it at this time, we would do it at this time, and so we did.
But to add a little bit to that, Anne mentioned to me, and I knew this already because John had gone through it, is that the Grant Association is not funded by the university, whereas the library and most of the staff is funded by the university. But the Grant Association director is not funded, so that money comes out of the Grant Association coffers, and it's slowly going down because of having to use it monthly to pay the director. So that's why we thought and as I said, we wish it could be more, but that's what we decided we could handle.
What would be your message to the next generation of the grant members that are coming up that you really haven't met or may not, just for the future and in general?
Well, I think the first thing, the most important thing that the average person can do is just send some sort of donation.
Well, and John and I talked about this, and we would like to challenge people to match that donation. And I think if people would be willing to do that, then I think the Grant Association will continue to live on and do the great things that it's doing, presenting the life of Grant and being able to let people come to the Grant Library and see all that he did for our country.
Understanding this is a broad question, can you explain the characteristics and skills of Grant that propelled him from a relatively obscure citizen in Galena, Illinois, to one of the most revered military heroes in history?
Yeah, so I think we should start with the foundation first. So he had graduated from West Point and had served in the Mexican War and was an excellent horseman. So he had a lot of skills that would lend itself well to a military career. I think the fact that he was out west mattered a lot too, because when they were forming the volunteer units in the summer of 1861, they really needed people that had that background and experience. So I think just the fact that he was West Point grad, he also, in addition, not only was he good at math, but he had a real interest in telling war stories. He was very clear and concise, and friends of his often commented about the clarity with which he could explain or describe something that had happened. So anyway, that's the foundation. Then if you look at as the war progressed, as I mentioned, I think being out west helped him a lot because he could develop outside of the limelight and outside of the glare of the Eastern Theater. And I also think, as Sherman noted, and I write about this in my book, that Grant had a real simple faith in success, and that's something that stuck with him the whole time. So Sherman noted at Shiloh, during the Battle of Shiloh, almost every soldier in the Union Army felt that they were going to be defeated on that first day, that Sunday in April, except Grant. And Grant somehow thought that they would achieve victory that day, and they did. And it was that, I think, belief in success that was critical to his overall achievements. I will add too, that belief in success, I think, is related to the belief that both his father and his wife had in him. So oftentimes Grant presents as kind of this, disheveled, slouching character. But I think that that's misleading, because I think he was a person who had great belief in himself. And I think he got that from his wife and his father, who also shared that belief.
But how did Grant's views on slavery evolve over his life?
Yes, so Grant's connection to slavery, I think, is deeper than a lot of Americans might know. And I think scholars are aware of this, but I think that the general public might not be as much. So in the 1850s, when he returned to St. Louis and worked as a farmer on his father-in-law's estate, Whitehaven, um, he was deeply connected with the institution, and his family, he and his wife and his in-laws benefited from slaves. So his view of slavery before the war was, was one who not only benefited from it, but didn't seem to be a critic of the institution so much. And even during the war, he in a letter to Congressman Washburn, he said, before the war, I wasn't even an abolition or even anti-slavery to speak of. So, and he even writes his father as late as 1862 during the war that, he wasn't really in this to solve the issue related to slavery per se, but was fighting to preserve the Union. So you have this sort of ambivalence or not having a strong opinion about slavery before the war. Some scholars point to the emancipation of William Jones, an enslaved person, in 1859 as maybe evidence that Grant had some sort of subtle anti-slavery views, but I just don't think there's enough evidence there to support that, especially when he hired out slaves after the emancipation of William Jones and received an income stream from that, especially when he moved to Galena, Illinois, with his wife Julia. So the change, I think, happens during the war, and it comes from the fighting, particularly during the Vicksburg campaign, when you had tens of thousands of enslaved people liberating themselves from the plantations of Mississippi, and the Union Army is faced with a dilemma. What do we do with all these freed slaves? And of course, one of the proposals, and what was implemented, was freed slaves were used in the Union Army, and they began serving. And when Grant saw them perform well, he embraced that policy as being a key feature of winning the war. And so I think that Grant evolved during the war, particularly I think late 1862, 1863 was the critical hinge. And then later in the war, he's corresponding with Lincoln and saying that he values the contribution of African-American troops. And after the war, he said they fought as well as anybody did. And you can see with that, and like Lincoln, I think one thing that they shared, and I think a lot of the soldiers shared this, is when you see someone risking their life on behalf of a cause, that almost is a way of earning one's citizenship and earning all of those freedoms that come with citizenship. So I think that you can see how his views are going to change. And by the post-war period, he's seeing freed people as being, valued citizens whose civil rights should be protected. So yeah, so I think that that's the sort of trajectory. But you can really see the change during that Vicksburg campaign. And shortly after the victory at Vicksburg, he tells his patron, well, Congressman Washburn tells Grant that, hey, whoever is able to utilize freed African-American in the armies is going to be a successful general. And I think that Grant recognized that. And he told Lincoln that he fully supported the policy, also around August 1863 or so. So yeah, it's a fascinating evolution, and it's funny, not that dissimilar from Lincoln's evolution on the issue of slavery and civil rights for African Americans.
Hey, the relationship of Halleck and Grant, especially after Grant's win at Fort Donelson. Can you explore that a little bit for us and give us some insight to that?
Sure. So the relationship with Halleck is a fascinating one, because at first glance, they couldn't be more dissimilar. Halleck was, an intellectual. He had written literally the book on military tactics prior to the Civil War, and he was nicknamed Brains for his intellectual acumen. Whereas Grant, that wasn't what people noted most about him, especially early in the war. But Grant lacked what Halleck lacked, and that was decisiveness and aggression, and also was someone who could lead men in combat. Something that maybe Halleck, not the strength of Halleck. So I think early on, Halleck perceived Grant as, a good fighter. He had an aggressive spirit, but terrible with organization and administration, and Halleck would lose his patience with Grant, his inability to, shortly after the victory at Fort Donelson, for example, to get his paperwork in or let Halleck know where he was. But then after Shiloh, Halleck was critical because he felt that Grant hadn't prepared his army properly and had been caught by surprise. One thing I think is really important to underline, though, is shortly after Fort Donelson, Halleck had a correspondence with McClellan, where he sort of throws Ulysses under the bus and hints at rumors of drinking. And there's no doubt that Halleck must have known that that was going to be extremely damaging information to share with McClellan. And Grant didn't know about that at the time, and only later found out about it when one of his staff officers was writing a military history of the war and came across that correspondence. And Grant was annoyed by that and mentions it in his memoirs. But I think that that's interesting because it makes it look like Halleck was a backstabber who didn't have Grant's interests in mind. But on other occasions, Halleck actually was somewhat loyal to Grant. For example, after Shiloh, if he wanted to, it wouldn't have taken much to kind of tip the scales against Grant. But Halleck sort of defends him and says, hey, this sort of thing happens when two armies face one another. And he kind of spoke on his behalf. And there were other times during the war where Halleck sort of had his back. So I think it's more complicated than Halleck sort of being threatened by Grant, even though he was to a certain extent. But he didn't go all the way with that. I think Halleck recognized Grant's abilities, particularly as someone who could bring that decisiveness to bear that was Halleck's biggest weakness as an officer. And so in some ways, it was almost like an odd couple, the two of them. And it was a relationship that ultimately won the war. And yet with all of the sort of kind of infighting and sort of jealousies that came with any kind of partnership like that.
Okay, next question, if you don't mind. This is a big one too. Lincoln's opinion of Grant, and maybe talk about their relationship and just how that worked out during their lifetime together.
Yeah, so one of the fascinating things about the period that I cover in my book is that they had never met until March of 1864, which is when my book concludes. So Lincoln doesn't know that much about Grant. And there's a funny story that in early 1864, Lincoln is concerned that Grant, fresh off the success of winning the Battle of Chattanooga, that Grant might be a threat to the presidency. And so Grant goes to Washburn, and who was a mutual friend. Lincoln knew Congressman Washburn, and Washburn knew Grant from Galena and had been his advocate all throughout the war. And Grant says to Washburn, hey, tell me a little bit about this guy. I don't really know much about Grant. And Washburn said, well, you know what? I actually don't know that much about him either. And then he recommends another mutual friend, a guy by the name of Russ Jones, who I write a little bit about, who is a central character in Grant's life. So many different capacities, among many of being his financial advisor. Nevertheless, Russ Jones goes out and assures Lincoln, oh, don't worry about it. He's not going to run for the presidency. And then, of course, to sweeten the pot a little bit, Grant is made lieutenant general and safely seen as not threatening to Lincoln's electoral prospects in November. So anyway, I just thought that was an interesting story. But so from early on in the war, Lincoln doesn't know much about him. He obviously values someone who is aggressive and isn't dawdling and takes the fight to the enemy. And Fort Donelson obviously was something that Lincoln was delighted by. And after Shiloh, that's when Lincoln said his famous, and it might be apocryphal, but it still, I think, gets it exactly right. I can't spare this man, he fights. Because everybody who came after Shiloh was like, oh my goodness, what a debacle. And we were lucky that we weren't thrown into the Tennessee River. But Lincoln stands by him and doesn't cashier him after Shiloh. And then similarly, early on in the Vicksburg campaign, there's another, and this one we do know that Lincoln said for sure. Even Grant's patron Washburn is a little bit dismayed and a little bit demoralized by Grant's lack of success early in the Vicksburg campaign, and Lincoln says, well, we gotta stick by this guy. He's a pushing fellow, or something to that effect. So so there is Lincoln that is the one that kind of stands by Grant, and then when Grant is successful at Vicksburg, Lincoln generously writes a letter to Grant and says, I thought when you crossed over the Mississippi that you should link up with Banks, but instead you went north, and I now will admit you were right and I was wrong. And that takes a lot for a president to say that to a subordinate. And I think that Lincoln had that kind of quality. But I think you also see maybe a greater intimacy between Lincoln and Grant at that point, where Lincoln's writing him directly, and then Grant is also letting him know shortly after that hey, I completely embrace the policy of using African American troops in the armies. So you see the relationship evolving, and then I really love this final scene of the book, one of the final scenes of the book, and that is when Grant goes to Washington, D.C., Ulysses is invited to the White House, and he shows up, and there's people there, and they want Grant to do a little impromptu speech, and he jumps up on a red sofa and delivers it. But that's when Lincoln and Grant meet for the first time, and Lincoln towers over Grant. And I think one of the great things about that scene too is that for all his success as a commander Grant had up until that point, as a public figure, he's still an amateur. He's still, the spotlight is now on him, and I think he was maybe a little bit overwhelmed by it, right? Because this wasn't something he was accustomed to doing, and wasn't one for giving impromptu speeches, for example, particularly in the White House with the president in attendance. So anyway, I just think that's an interesting snapshot. But yeah, their relationship was one of a distance relationship until March of 1864.
One of the questions, and it comes up a lot, is, as you know, wherever you talk about Grant's, one of the first things they talk about, right, is Was he an alcoholic? Did he drink to excess? How did it affect his life? And there's really strong opinions on both sides of the issue, I think. But since Grant has been labeled everything from an alcoholic, and I put in parentheses, Chernow made that comment, to those who believe alcohol did not play a part in his life, I ask you, where's the truth?
Yeah, so well, I'll start by saying I think the truth is somewhere in between the extremes, as it often is. But I'll give a little bit of my thoughts about this. So this topic has been covered so much, and I was reluctant to add another voice to it, but I felt that because my book was about Grant's development and his character and that trajectory from 1854 to 1864, you really can't ignore it. It's a central topic, even regardless of what you think. Others, there were strong rumors and there were beliefs and there were people had opinions about this, so it had to be confronted, right? And so I looked carefully, and one thing that I felt was important was trying to distinguish between the rumors and the wild accusations and the sort of anonymous scuttlebutt from the accounts of people that not only knew him, but were eyewitnesses to the events in hand. So, for example, Sherman noted that Grant drank and didn't hide it. And John Rawlins was very conscious of Grant's drinking. Now, some people might say that, oh, well, Rawlins was self-aggrandizing and he saw himself as his protector and he overstated it. I think that that's fair, but I still don't think you can just write off his views completely. It would be kind of, in my mind, it would be almost ahistorical to dismiss it out of hand. There was obviously something there, even if Rawlins was someone who exaggerated a little bit, maybe for his own, maybe it elevates himself a little bit to be Grant's protector, and I get that, but I still think that there was something there. One document I saw too was, Grant tumbled off his horse in New Orleans and hurt himself quite badly. And there's a letter from Banks to his wife that says that Grant was drinking. And I sometimes, I have a hard time thinking that a private letter to one's spouse that you don't expect is ever going to see the light of day, you would lie or tell a tall tale in a letter like that. So, and then finally, I would say that some of the accounts of his colleagues on the Pacific coast were actually friendly statements, like, "Oh, he really didn't have very much at the pay table in Fort Humboldt, and if they had an investigation, he would have not been dismissed." And I kind of felt that evidence seemed straight. I mean, it didn't feel like these guys were making that up. So anyway, it was an issue. How bad an issue was it? I don't think it interfered with his leadership and his command. I would also say too that there was a lot of drinking in the United States Army during the Civil War. So, it was not some bizarre thing. I mean, a lot of the officers were heavy drinkers, and it was not as uncommon as maybe people think nowadays. And then I would say that I think Julia, his wife, was often made sure to be around because people believed that she kept him on the straight and narrow. And I think that's true. And I think she and John Rawlins were kind of like a tag team of keeping him on the straight and narrow. And then I'll finally say is, alcohol was very shameful in the 19th century. We have our culture is different nowadays, where we have people will gladly share their challenges. That wasn't something that was the case. So Grant didn't talk about it. So he didn't want to be writing about it in his memoirs or go on some newspaper interview and talk about his fight with alcohol. So the fact that he didn't really talk about it that much, and it's sort of this hazy thing. But sometimes, though, when there's a public figure like that, it also opens the door for the rumors and the wild accusation. And there's no doubt, how much I don't know, a lot of the Grant was drinking stories are made up too. And that complicates it, because sometimes I think it's common for us to think, well, if one story was made up, well, then all of them are made up. I don't think that's the case, however. I think there were a lot of stories that were made up, and I think there's some of them were true. And I think at the end of the day, he was able to be a successful commander while at the same time battling that urge to drink, particularly when there was a lull in the action, or he was lonely, or between engagements or whatever. So yeah, it's a complicated topic, and like you say, there's passionate figures on both sides of it, but I come down somewhere in the middle.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Very interesting. Nice explanation. I just wanted I didn't send you this in advance, but
Sure.
when you wrote your book, you had to have several ideas, some salient points that you wanted to get out that were important about Grant, his character, and his life. And I'm sure my questions didn't address all that. So I'm just going to ask you, as you wrote your book and you got your points out, if you could just elaborate on one or two of those that we may not have discussed, that we can do that now.
Sure. One thing that emerged in my research that I actually think is a real positive story is how strongly he believed in the Union. And I think that sometimes I find that notion of the Union seems abstract in our time when we look back on that. But it wasn't for Grant. He thought the secessionists were a danger and were traitors to the country. And he knew them well because he had lived in Missouri for many years, which he saw was like a den of secessionists and slave owners. And when Grant went to Galena, he was able to really kind of embrace his unionism and his defense of the Union. And one of the things that I learned, and I make this point in the book, is the reason I believe this was so sincere and so strongly held by him is that, his family came over in the early 17th century. So he has an ancestor that literally came over shortly after the Pilgrims in the 1630 in what is now Dorchester in Massachusetts. And then later they moved to Connecticut, and then of course later went to Ohio. And I think that he saw himself as having a stake in the American experiment, and he had a great grandfather who was killed in combat during the French and Indian War in the 1760s. And I think that I believe that these sorts of things matter. The reason why I say I do is I'm someone who believes that the generations, have an influence, that, previous generations have an influence on all of us, right? And even if it's 100 years previously or whatever, some people might disagree with that as not having a significant impact. But, and so that was one thing that I found that was really fascinating. And I think that he didn't hesitate to join the Union Army after Fort Sumter. And he heard a fire and brimstone speech from John Rawlins in Galena, Illinois, and he turned to his younger brother who had been working at the store, the Galena retail leather store, and said, "Well, I guess I'm going to join up again." He said that to Orville Grant, and I just think that's a great scene, but also shows his commitment to the Union.
See, I'm glad that we got that out. That was very interesting, and I think very important that our members hear that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap it up?
No, I think you covered all of the big topics, I think, so yeah.
But it's a lot of times it's those little subjects that I'm sure you come across things and you go, oh my, just like you just said, how interesting that is. And
yeah, maybe I'll say one little thing. I don't think this is the most important thing, but for whatever reason, I was very fascinated before I started this book about his farming career, because it's just something that interests me, who knows why. And one of the things I discovered that he was a pretty good farmer. So I think that the myth was, Grant, he was just a failure at everything except being a soldier. And I didn't find that to be true. I found him to be a pretty decent farmer who not only was a hard worker, but kind of understood it and was given more and more responsibility. His father-in-law obviously believed that he was a good farmer because he let him manage the entire 900-acre estate because his father-in-law retired, and so he let Grant manage it. And that the only thing that prevented him from being successful was the panic of 1857, which, not to get into too much detail, but basically led to a depression in the price of grain. So it's very hard to make a go of farming when you can't sell your produce for very much money. And I think that was ultimately what sunk the farming career, because his father-in-law also had a lot of debts, right? So not only were the revenues coming in lower, but you still had to meet those debt payments. And at a certain point, he couldn't make it work, but it wasn't Grant's fault. You know what I mean? So anyway, I would say one thing I learned about him is that probably a pretty good farmer, to be honest, and maybe that's not something everyone knows, you know.
Yeah, and I like your point that he was somewhat successful in his early years.
Yeah.
And you ask anybody, any amateur historian or seasoned, and that's what they're going to tell you. It's just something that I think is repeated so much in history that it's just comfortable to start the story where Grant wasn't successful in his early life. Hauling wood, he couldn't make that. I mean, and farming. So you bring the point that he did a good job as a farmer.
And you know what else? One of the things that I kind of appreciated about him too is he was aware that working as a clerk in a store was maybe not the most prestigious job. So when he took the position from his father at the retail store in Galena, he was very clear when he's writing that he was doing it because he hoped to get an equity stake in the business eventually. His brother, his younger, he had two younger brothers, and one of them, Simpson, was going to die of consumption, and they knew that he was sick. And the father was waiting to kind of turn the store over to him and Orville if Simpson were to die. Anyway, long story short, he would have been an equity holder in a very successful business, which is a lot different than being a clerk, very much dependent on just your daily wage. And Grant was aware of that. And he wanted other people to know, like, hey, you know what? I'm doing this. This is an entrepreneurial move and not just a desperate move, you know.
So we could probably say in history, if the Civil War hadn't occurred, he would have been a successful man, just like he was in life as a general and a president. He had those qualities.
Yeah, I think so, you know, and it would have been interesting to see how that career would have developed, you know, when his father was very wealthy and he would have inherited money from Jesse. Of course, his younger brother Orville didn't. He sadly, not only did he take to drink, but he suffered some mental illness and squandered a lot of that inheritance. And Ulysses didn't get the inheritance because by the time that Jesse passed away, Grant was doing so well from his military career, making quite a lot of money. And Jesse said he makes enough already without having to get any of my. But you're right. He would have. I think he probably would have been a business owner of some sort had the war not intervened. You know?
All right. I just want to say thanks again for taking the time. I really appreciate it.